Welcome, pod people. Today is a solo cast with yours truly. One of the questions I get asked most often when I'm on the road has to do with my publishing journey or my writing process. So, really enjoyed recording this pod for you about my own sort of personal process, how I came to be writing books about Ayurveda and how I write. I've the Ayurvedic rhythms are baked into my workflow for sure. I work during certain times of day. And I also share about my own life altering journey, how I first got interested in Ayurveda through my own health journey, and how that is the thing that spurs me on to share and to write these books. So if you're somebody who thinks you have a book in you, or you're working on a book, or you're just a creator of another kind and you want to hear about publishing and you want to hear about writing, this pod is for you. And I hope you enjoy. Don't go anywhere. We're almost there. Welcome to Everyday Ayurveda with Kate, a podcast that translates ancient wisdom for modern lives. I'm your host, Kate O'Donnell. I've been living and teaching Ayurveda, India's traditional medicine, for over 25 years, and I've authored 4 best-selling books on bringing Ayurveda practices into our lives. If you're tired of battling digestive issues, hormonal imbalances, menopause symptoms, or are seeking a deeper spiritual connection and purpose, you're in the right place. This podcast is for you, offering practical, accessible advice to help you heal through diet, optimize your daily routines, and enhance your overall well-being. Follow this space for insights on a diet that heals, strategies for better digestion, sleep, hormone health, and direction for finding a deep sense of meaning and purpose. Join me, my pod people, for this empowering journey into self-care and self-discovery. Together, we'll explore how to bring balance and vitality into your everyday life. Let's do this. Well, pod people, this story begins in India, where I first discovered Ayurveda. And I had a lot of parasites from traveling and indiscriminate eating. And, I was only 20 years old at the time. I wanted to experience everything. So, of course, I got very sick, really didn't have any resistance in my body to the bugs from the tropics. And that was how I ended up in Ayurveda. I struggled for, I would say, the first 6 months. I kind of didn't do anything, and I let the parasites took over. And I ended up using Flagyl at the time, which is a wide spectrum antibiotic, which did a lot of damage, I would say, to my immune system and my gut in general. And it took me a year and a half to feel healthy enough to travel back to India. And then when I did, I got sick immediately again, almost within like 2 days of getting off the plane. So that was when my friends brought me to an Ayurvedic doctor in the city of Mysore. That was where I first experienced Ayurveda. I didn't really know anything about it. I was kind of in bad shape. So I was most interested in just doing whatever the doctor told me to do in order to heal and be able to stay in India and do what I had hoped to do there, which was practice yoga. So he recommended a panchakarma. At the time, I didn't really know what that meant. It was a residential thing that happened in a hospital. It took 3 weeks, and I was able to sort of go to the hospital every day, and I literally lived a few blocks away. So I would walk back and forth from the hospital to my house and still prepare my own food using the recipes that they gave me, which was khichdi. So it was basically a local variety of rice and a split mung bean and some spices. So I was sort of eating that at home every day and getting the treatments in the hospital, which involved having milk poured on my head. And it involved full body rub downs with oils, also enemas, purging, you name it. It was pretty intense. And I would say it opened a portal for me of knowing this body as a spiritual portal. as a means towards understanding the nature of reality. And there was something baked into this medicine that had to do with that. That had to do with understanding the spiritual nature of reality through the body. And that is what I had always been looking for. And so I didn't know anything about Ayurveda or about the process I had just been through, but I started trying to find out. So I started reading. I was still in India for a while, so I was getting books over there that were any book I could find written in English about Panchakarma or about Ayurveda. So I was sort of reading all these things and practicing yoga alongside and continued to kind of go back and forth, between India and the United States because I had a real burning desire to understand and experience that which yoga and Ayurveda were pointing towards. And that's what keeps me going to this day. I still travel back and forth. I'm still seeking experiences of the true nature of reality. That's what I'm here to do. And Ayurveda has been that for me very much, and yoga as well. So when I started sharing and teaching these subjects, I was lucky. I lived in Boston at the time. I was lucky enough to have a lot of people around and have a lot of opportunities to teach groups as well as individuals. So I was practicing doing consultations with individuals as well as I was featured in a lot of like yoga teacher trainings to do a day-long module on Ayurveda and just introducing sort of the lifestyle routines, some of the dinacharya, things like tongue scraping in the morning and drinking hot water and why we do those things. So I was teaching that and I was practicing as a consultant, which I don't do a lot of one-to-ones anymore. I'm doing a lot more group work. I'm doing a lot more outreach, this podcast being one of those methods, and the other big one being writing books. So the first book was born over the course of the first 5 years of me practicing Ayurveda with people in the city. I noticed that most of the people I was seeing, they had a lot of discomfort around food. They felt afraid. It seemed afraid of food, like it was going to hurt them or that they were going to make the wrong choice, and be eating something that was going to cause harm to their health. And the information that we were getting from the general daily feed, it seemed to change a lot. Avocados are really bad for you. And then 10 years later, they're really good for you. And I just couldn't, it seemed like it wasn't really helping people. The way that we talk about food seemed to be causing more angst than love. So people were angsty about food, and it's like, I want to eat what's right. Will you please tell me? Because I keep getting all this information that this is bad for me and this is bad for me and I shouldn't do this and I shouldn't do that. And it's in everything, right? Seed oils are everywhere. Sugar is everywhere. And it's a fear-based thing. And usually when you read an article or hear a podcast or something about one of these big don't do topics, there's also an offering for that which you are supposed to do, which could be a supplement in a lot of cases, it's like we're being sold a problem that this is bad and this is bad and this is all the bad stuff it's going to do to you. And then we're being sold the answer, which is to, buy this product. And I like that about the way Ayurveda is going. And I'm very careful, not to really pimp too many supplements and to really keep it about like food based, to really keep it about the activity of preparing food and enjoying food, that is the health giving essence of my work. And the information that I had learned and experienced through Ayurveda about how to use food for healing, that has been really transformative for me psychologically as well as physically. And that was a real impetus behind writing the first book. So nobody knew what to do about food. Nobody knew what to eat. Nobody knew, how to find quality food and prepare it. And so I was like, oh my goodness, we need a cookbook. We just need a cookbook because clients would come in over and over again. I'd be like, so how did you hear about Ayurveda? And they'd be like, well, I have a cookbook. I have an Ayurveda cookbook. I've had it for a long time, but it's just on my shelf because I don't know what my dosha is. So I just don't use it because I'm afraid I'm not going to do it right. And that's the story we hear about Ayurveda, right? You're probably with me on this, right? That you're afraid you're not going to do it right. So people weren't using their cookbooks because they were afraid they weren't going to do it right. So I was like, okay, there's another way to do this. We're taking the dosha thing out of it for one thing. And the doshic diets, like eating for vata type, eating for pitta type, that stuff's not in the Ayurveda texts. What is in the Ayurveda text is sort of eating seasonally. So, what are the foods that benefit bodies, human bodies, in the summer, in the wet time of year, in the cold time, and the hot time? That information is definitely there. Maybe the foods that are mentioned specifically in ancient India are different than the ones that we might choose today in our own climate and culture, but the qualities are the same, right? Like, for example, vinegars are heating. They're acidic. They increase heat and acid in the body. So at a time of year where the body's already hot and acidic, that would be summer, hot weather, we would choose less of those vinegary fermented things. So the text might say something like, in cold weather, enjoy fermented beverages, right? And so, hey, maybe that means a little honey wine, like mead, an ancient form of wine. Maybe nowadays it means kombucha or kimchi, right? So all these things can very easily be translated in general ways, that we can apply to our own lives and climates and cultures. So that's what I wanted to do with the Everyday Ayurveda Cookbook. And so one of my friends, Kara Brostrom, who has done the photography for all four of my books so far, she and I were chatting one day, and she had done, some work for my website. She built my website. Actually, I never would have had one if it weren't for her. She was like, "Hey, Kate, can I build you a website? Like, I really like Ayurveda. I think this is great. Let's do it." So that was huge that she sort of noticed something about what I was doing and what I was sharing, and she got on board. And we were chatting one day, and I think we should write a cookbook, together. You do the photos, I'll do the writing, And she was like, "Wow, that would be so cool." It was like a 10-minute conversation. Literally 24 hours later, I get an email from a former client, an Ayurveda client of mine, who had since become the acquiring editor at Shambhala Publications. And she said she had seen something that Kara and I had posted online a month or so before. And she's like, "Have you guys thought about doing a cookbook?" I was like, "Okay, obviously, universe, this is what's going on." So it was very clear that was happening, and that was the direction we were going to move in. So I was lucky in that I already had a publisher interested, and this acquiring editor really, she took extra time to walk us through the proposal process, which anyone who's listening, who's like wants to write a book, but kind of has no idea where to start, go to a publisher that you like, and you will find a submissions tab somewhere on their website. And then you can find the book proposal document that they'll want you to fill out. And you can just go ahead and do that, which basically you need an outline, you need a writing sample, like say an introductory chapter. And you also need market comps. This is the thing people don't, if you're not in the business, you don't know this, right? That you have to show that there is going to be something about your book that isn't already out there. So, I had to go through all these, let's say, all the Ayurvedic cookbooks that were already out there, which wasn't very many at the time. It was probably about 2012, let's say 12 years ago that we were having this conversation. And there hadn't been a lot of, there hadn't been a lot of new publications in Ayurveda yet. And it was just becoming, I would say, popular at that time. I was really sort of on the, even before the crest of the wave in the new publications and the, let's say, the public facing Ayurveda piece that's been slowly growing, over the last decade or so. So the market comps is like, all the other Ayurveda books out there, vegan cookbooks, wellness cookbooks, women's health cookbooks, Chinese medicine cookbooks, finding all of the different kinds of books that are similar, or in the same genre, let's say, that someone who's shopping for, they say they want to find like a traditional diet kind of book, or they're looking for like a cookbook that's about health and wellness, or they're looking for a vegetarian cookbook. So I had to kind of go through all the vegetarian cookbooks that were out there. And, I just spent time in bookstores browsing, honestly. I did a lot of the look inside feature on Amazon to get a feel for what was in the books, what they looked like, what their feel was, what the writing was like. this is like a 6 month process, going over the market comps. And then you have to say, this is what's different about my book. This is what's different. And so the vision that I had for the Everyday Ayurveda Cookbook was, at the time, I was embarrassed to say, I was like, I want it to look a little bit like Facebook, right? Because the books that we had so far, they weren't on a fancy paper stock. They were all kind of a paperback, grayish, brownish kind of old school paper, just, text, black and white. Maybe some of them had drawings. If they had pictures, some of them, the pictures were looking pretty outdated, but there wasn't a lush, beautiful Ayurvedic cookbook. And there wasn't, what I wanted was, because of the feedback I had from so many people walking into my office and talking about their Ayurvedic cookbooks, I knew I had the intel on why these cookbooks weren't working for people. And so I wanted to kind of go against that. And I think overwhelm was a big part of why these books weren't working for people. And so I was like, I don't want there to be any page in this book where you turn to the page and you just see a bunch of text. I want pictures. I want doohickeys. I want little dots or icons. I want color. I want a little box here that's, just has some like pithy information that stands out. So basically on every page in the book, I wanted to break up the text with just these sort of like eye-catching little bits so that you can digest just little bits at a time and not feel like you have to sit down and slog through this big book of text. And the color was huge. The designer that we worked with, she was a friend of ours. She was a member of our yoga community. She was a sister. Like, she understood what it was we were trying to do. And she lived the yoga and the Ayurveda as well. And I think that was a big part of what worked. So we had this sort of trio between design, photography, and writing. So, over the course of, I'd say it took us a year and a half to pump that book out, and I was rushing. I could feel that we were at the crest of something and that we were going to start to have a lot of publications. I didn't know what they were or who was writing them, but I could just feel that they were coming. So I rushed because I wanted this cookbook to get out there first. And it did. And 6 months later, the windfall of Ayurveda books began 6 months later. So my book was published in 2015, the Everyday Ayurveda Cookbook, and it did really well. It's been a great book. I think it's divided by the seasons, not by the doshas, and that's why it's so much more fun to use. So a person can buy the book and like literally just open towards, the fall, if it's fall, or spring, if it's spring, and just sort of cook it up, cook your way around. And then you'll find a little text box on a page that says something cool you never knew about oranges, or something cool about what Ayurveda says about sinuses. So all those things that you're thinking about in the winter, I sort of, peppered the winter section with those kinds of things. And at the heart of my work always is the user experience. And so I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think some people set off to write a book and you get caught up in what it is you want to say and how you want to say it, where more importantly, how will it be heard? How will it be seen? How will it land in a person? And so for my books, the design work is a big part of that. We're really meticulous about going back over that design over and over again. Anywhere where I felt like a person's going to feel turned off or overwhelmed or bored, that's why it had to be Facebooky. Like, we can't have people get bored and just put the thing down. Then it's not going to work. And the whole point is to bring Ayurveda into people's lives and really to get them cooking, because that is what I had seen as a practitioner, is that people weren't cooking. And if food is your medicine and you are disconnected from it, that's a difficult place to start. And I understand that some of you might be in a stage of life where it's not possible because, say, you travel for work or something like that. And so, yes, there's hacks, there's ways that you can get around it and do the best that you can. Most of my Ayurvedic friends, they travel with a little jar of ghee or a little baggie of chia seeds, a couple of herbs, spices, teas, right? All these things. I'll travel with a khichdi kit, just like a little bag of spices and some split mung beans and some rice. And ghee. I will travel with that so that when I get somewhere, I know that I can at least, a couple times have just that basic meal. And then that for me makes all the difference, So there's ways of getting around it, of course, but connecting to our food is important. I wanted to inspire people to connect, and it's working. That book is still doing great. We have a 10th anniversary edition coming out in spring 2025. Some of you might be listening to this. The book might already be out. So we went through and sort of made some improvements to some of the recipes. There's a new foreword, one by Amadea Morningstar, who her cookbook was the one that I was really immersed in as a Ayurveda student. And it's been really fun to create the 10-year anniversary and just sort of look at where the book has been and what it's done. And it was a great process. I really enjoyed doing it. And I gave everything to it, for a year and a half. Halfway through writing that book, I realized that as I continued to sort of see clients and work with yoga students, I realized that at some point along the line, no matter what we do, we run into psychological causes of our symptoms. We run into the role that the mind plays in the choices we make, whether we're going to eat out or eat in, what we're going to buy when we're choosing our food at the grocery store, whether we're going to go to bed on time or keep binging that show. The choices that we make all the time they're being driven by these mental processes behind the scenes. So before the Everyday Ayurveda cookbook was even done, I was already cooking up a new book. And this is how it always happens for me, that those of you who do nonfiction or even fiction writers, you probably know what I mean. It's like you're starting to go down a path and then you realize that path opens up into an entire another book, and you can't go there now. You can't. And so I had to sort of like put that all on the stack for later and say, this conversation about the psychology and the mind and its role in our food and our dietary choices and in our digestion. It's a big topic in Ayurveda. Ayurveda states many times throughout the text the importance of the mind in our health. So I wanted to write about that. I think it was a year after the publication of the first book that I started writing the second book. And so that book came to be known as Everyday Ayurvedic Cooking for a Calm, Clear Mind. So we had to do all over again the recipe development, and Kara shot all the photos, and she helps a lot with recipe development. That's a big job. Recipe testers, we had a team of testers. We were taking in their feedback and making changes to the recipes. Writing a cookbook, my friends, is a whole nother game from writing a not cookbook. You basically are doing two books. So when I work on these books, because these first two books, they are cookbooks, they each have 100 unique recipes, and they each have 50 to 75 pages of front matter. So the front matter is everything that happens before you hit the recipes. So it's where I give you the sort of introduction to Ayurveda, how to set up your kitchen, your pantry. In the second book, it's sort of how Ayurveda talks about psychology, what the language is, how it applies to food, all the things that we can do in our homes and in our daily lives and in our kitchens to create a more psychologically calm and clear environment. So that's all in the front matter. And I'll tend to work on the front matter for a time on its own. And then the recipe stuff is another project. So I do it's like I write two books. And so the second book, I actually got all the recipe stuff out of the way. Whereas the first book, I wrote all the front matter first, because the front matter was everything that I had been teaching. I had been teaching Intro to Ayurveda. I had been teaching Ayurvedic cooking. So I knew all that stuff, and I just had to get it from a workshop format, from my mouth talking down onto the page. I had to do some work around, my editor would point out how I use this. She's like, I can see you gesturing while you're teaching this, but we can't see you. It's a book, so you need to be more descriptive here, because we can't rely on your pantomime, because I'll tend to talk with my hands or move around the room, when I teach. So I had to learn, no, you can't use the same voice that you use when you're teaching, when you're writing, because people don't have the same access to you, and vice versa. So I got that first part out of the way. I was in India. I worked about 3 months on the first part of that book, that first book. And then we worked on the recipes, for a year after that. And I remember saying many times, I wish I wasn't writing a cookbook. Like for me, the front matter was actually the fun part, and the recipes are they're a bit more drudgery. It's just a lot of work. It is a lot of work to figure because I cook all this stuff all the time, but I don't use recipes, right? So I had to like pay attention to what I was doing when I was cooking and actually measure things and write it all down. Then you write the intro to the recipe and then you have the recipe tested and then you'd have to have it cooked multiple times. So that's been done over for 100 recipes. So you can think about how much work that is. It is a lot of work and it's a lot of detail oriented stuff. So I had like big post-it things on the walls, in one of the rooms in the house with all the little things that needed to be done, all the little things, just lists and lists of tiny things, like does the cumin seed need to be ground or are we going to use it whole in this recipe? Need to test it both ways, right? Does this one need more water or less water? All those little things. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy that I even made it through. And then I did it again. Then I did it again. And the first, the first book that was like a lot of the food that I eat. And so in the second book, I had to sort of go further and make more recipes and actually try and work on that a little bit more. And so I actually just got that part out of the way. Honestly, I was in India. I tend to write a lot there because, as you've probably noticed, when you're away from your home, you just have more time. There's less friends and family around. There's less like chores to do in the house. I usually just am renting a flat when I'm in India. And it's pretty simple. That's what I'm doing. And so I can get a lot of work done in that way. And I really like to write these books in India. It inspires me quite a lot, especially going to the food markets and some of the like healthier restaurants that are around in some of the towns and cities. So I got all that out of the way for this book and then had to write the front matter. And that took an entire another year for the Calm, Clear Mind book because it was hard to write about. The mind it's a tricky subject. It's murky up there. It's not always pretty. And I really went over and over it again, trying to find a language that was non-judgmental. And so I would read it over and over again. And my partner, Rich, he does a lot of work with the mind and psychological work. And I would read things to him, and he was a huge help to me. And I'd say, does that sound judgmental? Or is there a better way for me to say this? So that happened literally with like every paragraph in the front matter on that book in order to create this language about the mind. And I really hadn't read anything like it. There's one book by David Frawley called Ayurveda and the Mind, which has been around for at least 20 years. That was, I mean, amazing. To have another book about the subject was super helpful. But that was the only resource I had really, aside from the texts, which don't say as much as I thought they would about the mind. I didn't know that. I didn't know that, guys, going into it. So, so I had to sort of fish around, and I would say I found the most information actually in the Bhagavad Gita, and that's the text that talks about food and mind, actually. That's the text that is about the yoga of action. So living harmoniously in your day-to-day life. And that's a big part of what I'm teaching. So that text was really helpful. And then some of the yogic texts and some of the more introductory, let's say Vedic knowledge about psychology. That stuff was really helpful. But I had to really dig around to find that. It took a while. Took a while to write that book. And when I was done that second cookbook, which it's a kind of a fat book, that one has a more front matter and again 100 recipes. I was just like, whew, oh my goodness. And I published again with Shambhala, both books. I'm a very loyal person, and there's a real family vibe going on with me and the folks who own and run that company. Shambhala Publications, and they've been publishing Buddhist and Tibetan texts. So to add Ayurvedic texts to what they publish, it's a really nice feeling. And they allow me complete creative control of the book, which is really important. You may hear stories of people who pour their heart and soul into a book, hand it over to the publisher, and then are not in the end publishing a book that they're proud of or the book that they set out to write. So that's probably the main reason I keep going back to publishing with Shambhala is because I trust them. And when I handed over that first book, that was the first time, I had gone through a process like that. I can't tell you how vulnerable that is, and I felt like totally naked and totally just stripped. It was like, I don't have any kids. I don't even have a puppy, but if I did have a puppy, it was like, imagine going away for a year and you drop your puppy off somewhere and drive away. That's what it felt like. It was really one of the most surprising things about writing. It's easier now. Like it'll never be that hard again as it was the first time. And thank God it was Shambhala at the time. So I'm happy for that. And I've stuck with them. I've published all 4 books with them. So the third book, they asked me actually, they were looking at an old book of Ayurvedic home remedies by Dr. Vasant Lad, which was really old. It was kind of an encyclopedic book. And I think that was what, spurred them on to sort of, there's a market for a book that's got like home remedies in it. And so, of course, my sort of competitive self was like, well, I'm not going to let someone else write this book. So yes, I'll do it, even though I was kind of still reeling from the last couple of years of writing those first 2 cookbooks. So this book was not a cookbook. It was a home remedy book. It's called The Everyday Ayurveda Guide to Self-Care. And what became my interest in writing this book was actually what I noticed. Again, it seemed again that we had a problem in the Ayurveda publishing world. Even though we have a lot more books now, I felt like they all only covered introductory topics. You get through the 5 elements and the 3 doshas, which I covered in the first podcast. So if you're new to Everyday Ayurveda podcast with Kate, you go back to that first episode and get your introduction to Ayurveda. That's where I teach that. But I wanted to go further because Ayurveda also has a really fantastic model of the body that includes tissues and channels. There's 7 different kinds of tissue in the body. For example, your plasma, your red blood, your bones, your fat, your nerves, your reproductive tissue, understanding those 7 different tissues and how to nourish them, like what to feed them, in order to keep them balanced. I was so excited to write about that. And also the channel system of the body, which is sort of how things get moved around from the body. So for example, when you eat, it like sort of the food is transmuted somehow in your body into tissues, right? And so it's through the channels, and each of the different tissues has its own channel that through which it's nourished. We also have channels in the body for taking things in, like, food and breath and information. We also have channels for getting rid of things like poop and pee and sweat pores. It's so fantastic, right? Like there's this really, really helpful anatomy that just nobody was talking about. And I guess we thought it was only for Ayurveda students, only for people who were like in school learning to be Ayurvedic practitioners. And I was like, no, if we want to have home remedies and we want people to really understand how substances, balance the body, we want to understand the body better. So that book was actually really satisfying and really fun to write. It came out pretty easily because, again, in Ayurveda schools, I do teach those topics about the tissues and the channels. So I just kind of had to get it into a really digestible form. So people who, were new to Ayurveda could pick up the book and understand it. And then there's more like 60 recipes in this one rather than 100. And they're specific based on what we're trying to do in the body, whether it's clear mucus or feed the bones, there's very specific targeted ways that we can use substances like herbs, spices. There's a directory in there of herbs and spices, which again is one of those really detail-oriented things, where to create a directory where I tell like sort of the elemental composition and the qualities and the uses of lists of spices and also of herbs, things like lavender, triphala, Western herbs like rosemary are in there as well. That was fun though. I enjoyed doing that. So you get front matter, you get the directory, and then you get the recipes. And so if you go back to the directory, you can sort of understand more deeply how the recipes are working. Because what I didn't want to do was write a book where you look up psoriasis and then you open to the page and it says like, do this for psoriasis, like mix baking soda with lime or, whatever. I'm making this up, but that was not what I wanted to do because that gets us right back into that sort of more Western mindset of problem, fix it, rather than understanding the causation of the problem and sort of solving the problem on its root level. So I really wanted to create a book that with that environment. I'm sure if I had written just a home remedy book where you just open to the page for like cold sores or whatever it is, I'm sure that book people would enjoy more, maybe find more useful, but that was not the book I was going to write because that's not how I teach it. It's not how I use Ayurveda, and that's not what excites me about Ayurveda either. So that book's great for people who, don't want a cookbook. They don't want to like learn how to make all these meals, but just want something for their digestion. So that's where those recipes are. And then I was like, gosh, I think I'm done. I think I'm done writing, like one thing you should know is that books don't pay the bills. They really don't. It's kind of like being a musician, even if you have like a really popular album, you still don't make a lot of money. You have to go on tour and hope for ticket sales and all these things, Being an author these days is you have to do a lot of other things in order to financially survive. Books, podcasts, social media, a lot of what I do is unpaid. It's unpaid work to sort of create the brand, right? But you have to be selling, you have to be marketing something. So I think a lot of authors are speakers. They go around and get paid, a lot of money to speak at, like a graduation or a corporate seminar or something like that. It's one of the ways you can do it. Some people self-publish and then you keep more of the money, when you publish a book. Again, I keep publishing with Shambhala because of their art direction. They choose amazing paper stock. They make beautiful package. They make a beautiful book. And that has been important to me with these 3 books because I felt that that's what we didn't have was a very luscious, draw you in through your senses kind of book. And so that's what we're doing with those books in the 4th one as well. And that one came around. It was during COVID. I think it was summer of 2020 probably, or 2021 maybe, that I had not been as busy. So of course I get the urge to write another book. And I wanted it to be about women's health because so much of what I've lived around healthy menstruation and breast health, the ways in which women move through the world, psychologically, energetically, physically, so much of how I have come to understand and work harmoniously with this body has to do with Ayurvedic approaches to women's health, like things like menstruating and a difference in nourishment and in exercise and in focus, during that time of the month, let's say. I also wanted to talk about the relationship between the body and the moon. And that's something that's very deeply fleshed out in yoga, more so than in Ayurveda. But as I've already described, I've been into both of these systems side by side for these decades now. So it felt really natural to include that. And I just, at the time, and this has changed since 2020, but at the time I felt like, people just aren't talking enough about it's like taboo or embarrassing to talk about bleeding or boobies or, all the things. And I was like, I just had a real fire to talk about that stuff and to use the Ayurvedic language to talk about it because I felt it's so helpful. The way we look at the channels, the way we look at the tissues, the way we look at the doshas and the digestion and how we are nourished. All of these things and how they are all connected to our environment, to the cosmology around us. I wanted to give that gift to women. And I wanted to create a conversation in women's health that had that at its center, that had a sense of women's bodies as cosmic spaceships moving through the world. And I didn't think we had that. I didn't feel like we had that, at least not not through an Ayurvedic lens, you know. And there was part of me that was like, oh my God, Kate, are you going to write another book? Like, you can't afford it. You know, you can't afford to like take all this time off and write a book that really doesn't, you know, for the number of hours you put into it, it does not flesh out financially. However, I continue to have this love of creating books. I love to do it. There's a lot of research involved. I like to, so let's talk about workflow here. I like to shut down my other work as much as possible and work on a book. I don't like to move in and out of the writing. Like I resent when I have to go do something else, like make a PowerPoint for a teaching gig or something. I'll be like, oh my gosh, this is just taking me out of when I'm working on a book, I am like moving into a an energy vortex where the book exists and it's coming through the cosmos, this book, and it's like pixelating in this space, you know, like I picture this sort of like whirling when you see the wind go through an alley, you know, and sort of like swirls in the corner. It's like that, you know, there's this swirling vortex of the beingness of the book coming through. And I feel so close and connected to the tradition of Ayurveda at these times that I think I'm a little addicted to that, to be honest. Part of why I keep writing books is because I want to become close to Ayurveda by entering into that vortex together with her to create something that brings her into the world. And for whatever reason, for me, when I work on a book, that becomes prescient. That experience just takes over. And so I don't like to have to leave that space to do other things. With the women's health book, you know, it's a bigger book. It was more work. It was more work. Again, at the time, I wasn't really finding a lot of books about women's health through the Ayurvedic perspective. There's a few, I list them in the resource section for sure. But everyday Ayurveda for women's health, it was a lot of research and a lot of writing. You know, I really had to write about all the different things that, you know, it's amazing in a lifespan what a uterus, fallopian tube, vaginal canal, what all that stuff does. You know, there's fertility, there's pregnancy, there's the postnatal, there's menstruation, there's perimenopause, there's menopause, and there's just the general sort of aging process. So all of that, I had to sit down with each of those topics in turn. And it was a lot of work. And for about 3 months, one fall, I did only the bare minimum of other things. And I just worked on the book sort of all day, every day. So we talk about workflow. You know, I've learned a lot. I would say with each of these 4 books, my process of writing has been a little bit different. Each time, you know, I have to do the proposal. So each time I have a table of contents first. You know, I sort of try to envision the book, knowing that it's going to change. Keep that in mind if you guys are trying to do that. Know that it's going to change, but you just need to get something, right? You just need to get something and you're going to move it around. Some things will get cut, other things will get added, you know, so your original table of contents is not going to be the end all, but you need enough there that you can get going. I think a lot of people might get stuck right there. So I just kind of get it down, you know, and I just get it down, the big picture. What is it I want to say, you know, and what's important about the way that I say it? And I'll do market comps. I do find that you know, poking around, reading other books is super helpful. And as I'm reading all these other books, it's like, what do I like and not like about these books? What's missing in these books? What is it that I can add that hasn't already been done? That's important. The publisher definitely wants to hear that. And so does the reader. They want to know, why should I, you know, I have a bunch of books. Why should I also have this book? So that proposal I always do that first. And then once I'll have that TOC, that table of contents, and I'll sort of stand back and say, which part do I want to write first? Which part of this book do I want to write first? You know, the women's health book, for example, is divided into 4 parts. So there's sort of the Ayurvedic view of women's anatomy. That's part 1. And that was super fun to write. Part 2 is dinacharya and ritucharya, so daily and seasonal routines. Part 3 is where I went in turn with each of the stages of life. So we talk, you know, chapter on fertility, chapter on perimenopause, etc. And then part four is the recipes. And I cross reference those throughout part three, where I'll say, if you're looking for, something for hot flashes, go to page blankety blank, So the book is organized in that way. But of course, I wrote part one first because I am an anatomy dork. And that is my favorite thing, is to write, to take the Ayurvedic knowledge, and explain it in sort of modern terms and help people find this experiential language for understanding their body. So that was the funnest part. So I'll sort of say, okay, I'll do the fun one for whatever's funnest first. So with this fourth book, I did the recipes last. And again, there's about 50, 60 recipes in this book. So it's not, a full-on cookbook like the first two. I don't think I'll ever do that again. I don't think I need to. I think the first two cookbooks are freaking incredible. We don't need them again. You already have 200 recipes there, and I teach you how to modify them. So it's kind of infinite. So I'll sit back and I'll write that first part. And then, when I'm done that, I'll go to the second part. So then, okay, part two was the Dinacharya Ritacharya. So, okay, there we go. We're going to write about the routines again, even though I've written about them in all of my books. But each time it's with a different spin, One time we're really looking at psychology. This time we're really looking at women's health. So I'll do the book like one part at a time. And then, and I'll take time off. So I'll take a week or 2 weeks or a month, and I'll go like stay in somebody's house that lives somewhere quiet, or I'll go to India. A lot of the time I've been known to work on the road. Because again, like I said, when you're home, it's like busy. There's a lot of other things to do. So I'll tend to write when I'm away, and that's all I have to do. And I have learned about myself when is the best time of day to work. And a lot of writers I talk to, they do the early morning thing. But because I've been involved in yoga for so many years, I'm really trained to be in the yoga space in the morning. And I tried writing in the morning, but it disturbs me. It disturbs me to engage the mind in that way. So the yoga stuff has to happen first, the practice of whatever it is, at any given time. That's a different podcast. But I'll do that first and just sort of like clear the channels of the mind as well, and have, my first food of the day. And I tend to really start getting going during the pitta time of day. So that's around 10 a.m. So usually I start working around 10, sometimes 11. I'll make sure that my food prep is done, so I know what I'm going to eat that day and I have what I need, because what you don't want is to walk out of the desk space and not know what you're going to do about food, because as I'll describe, the writing process definitely gets you in that space where you don't know what to do with your physical body. So I make sure that like the food's lined up for the day before I start working. And so usually I get there around 10 or 11. And I will find that I hold a lot of tension in my body when I'm sitting at a computer. I'm sure a lot of you notice the same. And I have to limit the number of hours that I work on a writing project. So I'll usually do, say, like a 90-minute bout, sometimes 2 hours, and then I'll take a break. I take a walk. I'll take like a 20, 30-minute walk around the neighborhood often. Go, refresh my CCFT. I've learned on the first two books, I did a lot of indiscriminate snacking, a lot of eating. So it was like when I was challenged by, trying to spit something out and like couldn't get there, I would like go eat something. That was how I dealt with the frustration. In the third and fourth books, I didn't need to do that anymore. So I'm very happy with that. I can just kind of shut myself up now and work and then take a walk and then go back to work. And when it's mealtime, and I take plenty of time for that. I don't rush through the meal in order to like hurry back to the work. I will push the appetite. I'll admit that sometimes I don't eat because I know that if I walk away from the writing right now, it'll be really hard to get back to where I am. So sometimes I push it. That's why I eat a meal before I sit down to work. So that some nourishment is there. And I can go a number of hours without eating. I don't have that kind of crazy metabolism. So it's good for me in that way. And I've also learned that if I do more than 5 hours in a day, it's very hard for me to calm down. I'll get like, my mind will easily get sort of obsessive about the work and I won't be able to sleep. So I've learned that. So I sort of have this window from, say, 11 to 4, and that's 5 hours. And maybe out of that five, I'm actually sitting at the computer for three, but I can get a lot done in 3 hours where I'm completely focused. So what I've learned is that it's not about typing on the keyboard for the 5 hours. It's about the flow and the process that takes 5 hours in order to work for three. Right. And from day to day, it's different for me. I know some writers are like very regimented about it. You know, they do 2 hours every day or 1 hour every day. That is not how I have chosen to do it, but I also have a lot more freedom in my schedule than many people do. So I understand why a lot of people do write first thing in the morning or they do an hour every day. For me, I find it really frustrating mentally to move in and out of the space so often, the writing space. So I would prefer to just like really dive in and be doing like 5 hours a day for 2 or 3 months. And that's my flow. And I have really learned about that midday time. I do not work past, I mean, sometimes, okay, I'll get a late start and I'll go till 5, but I do not work past 5. And sometimes I'll work in the early morning, but I know it's going to be hell to pay, you know? So if I wake up at 4 in the morning and like there's something going on, I'll grab the laptop, sit in the bed and spit it out. I prefer when it's not that way, but sometimes it is for sure. So my schedule's a lot more flux than you might imagine, right? And I definitely, rather than doing small bits every day, I do these like big bouts. And part of the reason why it's difficult for me, I say I can't afford to write another book is because I shut down my other work. So a lot of my work is teaching, speaking, running this online platform, the community membership. You know, there's a lot of admin that happens. I have a virtual assistant who helps me out with content creation, with social media, course creation. You know, there's a lot of content creation going on. And that's my business. You know, that's how I run my business. And the books they're kind of outside of that. I think I get many of my teaching and speaking gigs because I'm an author, you know, but there's all this other stuff that has to happen in my work as well. And so a lot of that gets really put on the back burner when I write a book. And so that is something I've had to really learn how to consider. If you're going to shut everything down, for how many months are you going to do that? What impact is that going to have on the business and on income? And I think that's a lot of you probably struggle with that, you know, that you have this book that you want to write, but there's, you know, this financial pressure. Where do you find the time? You know, so some people will be able to take off a week or 2 weeks or a month and put that time into writing, whereas other people will find just that hour every day. But again, if you're feeling like overwhelmed, recommendations I often make when folks ask about, you know, how do you get on the writing journey is, as I said, to find a submissions proposal from a publisher and really look at that and sort of mock fill that out, because that will really help you get clear on what it is that you want your book to be. And I think a great way to get started is to write smaller bit, write articles. You know, you can write articles and send them to brands or companies that are in your field. You know, publish for Banyan Botanicals. They have a great blog sometimes, things like that, magazines, Mind Body Green, you know, Yoga Journal, stuff like that. I think starting to write, say, like 1,000 to 2,000 word pieces that you send out now, if you like, you know, to different sort of blog creators, magazines, things like that. And keep all that, because it's still going to be your book someday. There's nobody said that you can't start writing, you know, and start publishing articles. Another way you can do that is to start a Substack. A lot of writers have a Substack account. It's like the new blog, you know, it's just a place where you're sharing your writing, and people can subscribe for free or they can pay. And it's a great way to task yourself with continuing to show up for creating your content, you know, for writing. So if you were to say, do the mock submission proposal and like get a TOC going, a table of contents, just flesh it out to the best of your ability. I think a lot of writers, they grow into the table of contents. They just start writing and like create, you know, the writing itself draws them along. For me, it's the kind of the other way around. I need a TOC first, and so does the publisher, because I'll generally get the contract for the book before I write it. Whereas I think a lot of people write the book and then send it out. Either way, writing sort of articles or smaller bits like essays on sort of each of the topics. And then later you can do what I call the connective tissue, which is where you lay it all out in the book and read your way through it and write your way through it, where you sort of put the threads together. How does this lead to this, which leads to that? And that's how your individual articles become a book. And the connective tissue. So I will have little bits because, as I said, I'll write this part and then that part and then that part, right? And they're not necessarily in order. I do not work in order. I just write whichever part is calling to me right now. And say it takes me a week, 7 days to get through it. And then I have that and I stick it over there, and then I start the next one. And then the connective tissue has to come later, where I have most of the bits and then I put them together and write my way through the book. And that's a really fun time in the writing. But so you don't have to have it all, connected and all the connective tissue in place in the beginning when you're just writing these smaller bits. And I encourage you to sort of have a platform where you can publish those, share those like in a blog or a Substack or a newsletter or something. Some people even do it on social, they're writing things or making videos saying things that are parts of a book. So think about, the book that you want to write as content creation that you're doing now. And if you can get yourself in an environment where you are sharing bits of it now, it's going to buoy you up and keep you moving along in that direction. I think with the question of workflow, you do have to carve out the time. You do have to find the time, whether it's going to be a big chunk in the summer or over Christmas break, or it's going to be these little bits every day. But both of those are viable options. Different writers work in different ways. And so you might try both. So can I get a weekend away? Like, what can I get done in a day? You'll find it's more than you think when there's nothing else bothering you, or nothing else coming at you. So I'm definitely open to hearing, more feedback on this pod, more questions you might have about your own process, about my process. But it's just something that people are asking all the time when I'm traveling on the road. They want to hear about my publishing journey or my writing process. So I'm happy to share this with you. I hope you found it interesting. And do keep in touch. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks for being here.